I have a question on Romans 11.
Okay.
I know in Romans 11 is talking about Israel, the two jumps back and forth from the unbelievers and the believers. Who are the two Israels that God is referring to? Like, is it just the unbelievers in general, or is he speaking about the church and the church age? And then my specific question is on verse 15, where it says that the Israel that was cast away will be received again. And what does that mean?
Okay. Well, let's read from verse 11. Romans 11, verse 11 says, I say then, have they stumbled that they should fall? God forbid. But rather through their fall, salvation is come unto the Gentiles, for to provoke them to jealousy. Now, if the fall of them be the riches of the world, and the diminishing of them the riches of the Gentiles, how much more their fullness? For I speak to you Gentiles, inasmuch as I am the apostles of the Gentiles, I magnify mine office. If by any means I may provoke to emulation them which are my flesh, and might save some of them. For if the casting away of them be the reconciling of the world, what shall the receiving of them be but life from the dead?
Like, I'd always thought that this was having to do with when God stopped using Israel and then the Gentiles at Pentecost when he started using the church. But then I don't understand how that fits into verse 15.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, it does. Actually, it's interesting how God is saying that the fall of Israel brought salvation to the Gentiles, back in verse 11. But rather through their fall, salvation has come to the Gentiles. And the Gentiles would be the churches, because the Gentiles form the New Testament churches and congregations. You see the similarity that through Israel was the people of God for, depending on where you put their starting point, Abraham for over 2,100, 2,200 years, or Jacob, born in 2007 BC, all the way to 33 AD when the veil of the temple was rent. So for over 2,000 years, Israel's the people of God, and then through their fall, God begins to evangelize to the nations of the world, the Gentiles. And many Gentiles come in and are saved over the course of the 1955 years of the church. Well, look at the similarity where God uses the churches for almost 2,000 years. Similar length of time to that he used Israel. And then God ended the church age, which really could say the fall of the Gentiles. First was the fall of Israel that produced salvation for the Gentiles. Then you have the fall of the Gentiles, the fall of the New Testament corporate church. For what purpose? Salvation of a great multitude outside the churches and congregations. It's a pattern that God has established. He'll use a corporate entity, a corporate body, as Israel for 2 millennium. Then through their fall, he has another plan to save people. He'll use the church. Then through their fall, he has another plan to save the great multitude. And really, a little further on in this same chapter, God speaks of the branches, and he has some words of warning for the New Testament church. As he just said, through Israel's fall, salvation comes to the Gentiles. Well, he says in verse 18, boast not against the branches, but if thou boast, thou bearest not the root, but the root thee. Thou wilt say then, the branches were broken off, that I might be grafted in. Well, because of unbelief, they were broken off, and thou standest by faith. Be not high-minded, but fear, for if God spared not the natural branches, that would be Israel, the Old Testament Israel, take heed, lest he also spare not thee. New Testament corporate church. So it's a direct warning. Look what I did to Israel, and I spared them not, and yet they're the natural branches. Well, take heed, because the same can happen to you. Of course, the church completely denies that's in the realm of possibility. God would never leave us, never forsake us. They completely missed the warning here through being high-minded, and they refuse to fear. And it says in verse 22, behold, therefore, the goodness and severity of God on them which fell severity, but toward thee goodness. if thou continue in his goodness, otherwise thou also shall be cut off. Very clear, very clear. The church stands by grace, right? In God's sight. No, the church, the corporate body, does not stand by grace. The individual child of God stands by grace through the faith of Christ in God's sight. It's all of God's goodness and his grace to the individual. He'll never cut off the individual. But the corporate body is in a works relationship to the law of God and to God himself, just as Israel was. Israel was obligated to be faithful. They failed, and after putting up with their failure, God cut them off. He ended his relationship with national Israel. Then he began a new relationship with a new corporate entity, the New Testament church, and again for a long period of time. And then after giving space for them to repent, as Revelation 2 tells us, and if God gives space to repent, it means you're obligated to obey him, to keep his commandments. And if you fail, it says in Revelation 2, after giving that space, he came and he cast them into great tribulation. And that's the judgment on the church. And so the church has failed to heed the warning and has also now been cut off, just as the natural branches, leaving God dealing with just individual people outside of the church, outside of Israel. He does not deal through corporate entities any longer.